Hello everyone, and welcome to the ACRL LES Virtual Participation Committee's Spring Discussion Forum. My name is Ava Berlat, and today I have the honor of introducing the masterminds behind 23 Framework Things, Amy Mars, Kim Pittman, and Trent Brazier, winners of the 2018 ACRL Instruction Section Innovation Award. 23 Framework Things is a free online professional development resource that helps librarians engage at their own pace with the framework for information literacy through readings, activities, reflection, and discussion. Amy is the Research, Instruction, and Outreach Librarian at St. Catherine University. Kim is the Information Literacy and Assessment Librarian at the University of Minnesota Duluth. And Trent is the Education and Social Sciences Librarian at the University of St. Thomas. If you have not already done so, I encourage you to engage with 23 Framework Things at 23frameworkthings.wordpress.com. Amy, Trent, and Kim have created a wonderful resource for engaging with the framework. For this interactive discussion, we'll be focusing broadly on the intersection of the framework with humanities librarianship. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to type your questions and responses into the chat box. As much as possible, we want to share your insights as well as your questions, so please feel free to share your experiences throughout the discussion. A focus on the practice of humanities librarianship would be appreciated, but not required. So, without further ado, I'll let Amy, Kim, and Trent lead us through what is sure to be an interactive session. Take it away.
Thank you, Ava. This is Trent. Thank you for that great introduction. As Ava said, we are the people behind 23 Framework Things, and we wanted to take a quick look at the intersection between the framework and humanities librarianship.
So thank you for the lovely introduction, Ava. Just to elaborate a little bit on that, this is Amy. I wanted to add that I also am liaison to many humanities departments in my role at St. Kate's. So I work with history, English, theology, philosophy, women's studies, international languages, and ASL interpreting. And I guess we also, a webinar to the Literatures in English section of ACRL wouldn't be complete without a literature reference. So we thought it apropos to redesign the cover of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and rename that the Humanities Librarian's Guide to the ACRL Framework. And like Douglas Adams would say, no need to panic because it's mostly harmless, and hopefully you'll walk away today with a lot of different ideas and resources to take with you to apply the ACRL framework in your teaching practice to the humanities departments you work with.
All right, so I'll give you a little bit of information about what's in store for our session today. We'll be sharing a brief overview of the structure of the framework and some of the theories that inform it. We will give you a quick tour of the 23 Framework Things website and talk about how you can utilize that to learn more about the framework. We'll share some practical examples of the framework in action in the humanities and some humanities adjacent disciplines. And then we'll talk a little bit about kind of continuing our learning around the framework using communities of practice. And then finally, we'll hopefully have some time to discuss whatever questions jump in or come up along the way. So feel free to throw your questions into chat if you have some as we go along today. And so next, we'd like to find out a little bit about who's here with us. And so I've just opened up a poll that hopefully you can view. And I'll ask you to go ahead and respond to that about what areas you are liaison to. Great. So clearly a lot of variety and a lot of other. So if you'd like in the chat, feel free to go ahead and mention to us if other captures best what your liaison area is. Feel free to go ahead and share what that area is in the chat box. All right, so hopefully when we share examples throughout the session, you'll see some that connect to your areas. If we don't share an example that directly connects to a liaison area that represents you, we will talk about some other opportunities to find examples within your discipline. All right, thanks everyone for sharing.
So next we want to get a sort of temperature check of how comfortable you are with the framework. And so we'll do a little Likert scale. Whoops, 1 second here. And so thinking of 1 as, you know, maybe a first date with the framework, you just met, you're not sure what you think about the framework, just still getting to know it, to 5 being kind of like your BFFs, like Abby and Alana on Broad City with the framework. So go ahead and kind of put your assessments of your comfort level with the framework in there. So it looks like we have kind of a spectrum of levels of comfort level with the framework. So hopefully the next few slides where we go into a little bit about the structure and the theories that inform the framework, that will bring you up a little further closer to 5 throughout today. But definitely feel free to ask questions as we go throughout.
All right, thanks, Amy. I'm going to show a bit about the structure of the framework. So we've got our frames, knowledge practices, and dispositions. So I'm actually going to jump over to the framework, so you should be seeing that in a second here, and talk about what it looks like. So just from the ACRL site, we've got the framework, and it is organized into the frames, obviously, since it's a framework. And there are 6 major frames, starting with authorities, constructed and contextual, and ending with searching as strategic exploration. There is no weight here. It's not that the authority one has more weight than the searching as strategic exploration. They're actually just in alphabetical order. So these are the 6 main concepts. And as you look individually at each frame, you'll see underneath that there are descriptions of what each frame is about. And really an underutilized part of the frames are this paragraph underneath that talks about kind of the continuum from novice learners to expert learners. Your eyes immediately jump to the knowledge practices, which are the kind of the cognitive side of the frames, and you look at them because they've got those bullet points and it's easier to parse those out. And as well as those cognitive abilities, the framework goes a little bit further than the standards, the former standards, and looks at dispositions, kind of the affective and your attitudes and feelings towards information. So you'll see the same format underneath each of the 6 frames.
So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is Amy again, about some of the theories that really informed the creation of the framework and a lot of the changes that we see from the standards. And so first I want to talk about meta-literacy. So the concept of meta-literacy expands on what we think of as kind of the traditional information literacy skills, determine your information need, find access, etc. So a very kind of behavioral approach to information literacy that we have in the standards, whereas meta-literacy really includes the collaborative production and sharing of information that happens in participatory digital environments that are really prevalent in our engagement with information today. And these concepts were first articulated by Mackey and Jacobson in their book, Meta-Literacy, Reinventing Information Literacy to Empower Learners. And there's a couple of resources that are linked from this slide I want to point out. They do have a website that has a lot of really great information that you can click on below the diagram of meta-literacy there. They have a MOOC, and they also have a more recent book that talks about putting meta-literacy into practice. And the way that you see meta-literacy play out in the framework is how the framework emphasizes students as creators and contributors to the scholarly conversation, in the scholarship is conversation frame, as well as in the information marketplace, as in the information has value frame. You can also see this in the emphasis on reflection and metacognition in many of the dispositions. For example, in authority is constructed and contextual, we're looking at how students are reflecting on their own biases when they're evaluating information. And we can also see, as Trent pointed out, some of the more effective elements of learning incorporated into the framework through the dispositions. So how we have this in 23 Framework Things is actually thing number 19 is really all about metacognition. And we were very, very lucky to actually have Trudy Jacobson participate in this thing, one of the writers of the meta-literacy book. And so what this thing asks you to do is, instead of reading and writing comments, we actually have some Flipgrid videos that you can watch and record your own response in video form to the questions of why metacognition is important to information literacy and how to incorporate it into your teaching practice. So the next major theory that informs the framework are the threshold concepts. So these concepts were coined and first studied by Meyer and Land, who described threshold concepts as akin to a portal, opening up a new and previously inaccessible way of thinking about something. It represents a transformed way of understanding or interpreting or viewing something without which the learner can progress. So you can kind of think of these as really just sort of the core ideas and processes that students need to know to advance in their learning. And often these are defined or different depending on what disciplinary or sort of information community that you're a part of. And so a lot of times these concepts tend to be a little bit unspoken. And because of that, and the reason for that is when you think about the way we develop mastery, students are often starting out not really sure, not knowing that they don't know a lot of things about information literacy or a particular discipline. And then as they learn, they start to become aware of sort of those gaps in their understanding. So they develop some conscious incompetence. And then hopefully they advance through. And eventually when you master a particular field, you're often put in a position where you're no longer aware of what you know. And this is where we often see sometimes professors at. And so really articulating those threshold concepts is something that librarians can play definitely a role in as sort of translators between disciplines for students. And so how you see this in the framework is the focus on essential understandings and big concepts that can be sticking points for students who are emerging as information literate. And you can also see it again in that acknowledgement of how students are moving from novice to expert in information literacy. In terms of 23 framework things, we also have a thing that introduces you to threshold concepts. And you have a couple options of how to participate in that. You can either post a critique or a reflection to a reading that really looks at threshold concepts in the Delphi study that informed those concepts and their inclusion in the framework. Or you can think about what threshold concepts are in the disciplines that you're liaison to. Lastly, we have Understanding by Design, which if you haven't read this yet, I really recommend it. For me, it's really transformed my teaching practice, but there's an amazing book by Wiggins and McTeague that help us mindfully create curriculum that promote understanding, transfer of learning, and authentic assessment. And there's a few different elements entailed in this, but one of the major things is the 3-step backwards design process, where, instead of coming up with your lesson plan first, thinking about assessment later, you really start with what are your learning goals and outcomes? How are you going to know when students achieve those or have understanding? And then from there, plan your instruction. And basically how this relates to the framework is the framework is really helping us or trying to encourage us to move away from a one-shot model, not that it can't be used with a one-shot model, but really starting to think about information literacy as a curriculum that recognizes learners on a journey from novice to expert. It has us, again, focus on essential understandings and really to organize our teaching around those, so those you can see in the frames. And if you can put the slide forward one, Trent, it can also help us avoid the pitfall of trying to cover too much in one session, which is something I still struggle with. So this image right here comes from Notes from the Field, an article by Megan Oakleaf and others et al. That help us think about how do we prioritize learning goals and outcomes. And we do have a thing for Understanding by Design as well that helps you explore how to think about backwards design and organizing your content around essential understandings of information literacy in your own teaching practice. And we also have a button, this is worth mentioning. Trent will go over some of our incentives, but we also have a button for completing our assessment track that actually says, what would Megan Oakleaf do? So we're big fans of Megan Oakleaf over here.
All right, so building on some of what Amy shared about the theories that inform the framework, I'll give a little bit of a summary here about some of the ways in which the framework is different or departs from the standards. So one key difference is the way that the two documents view information. In the standards, information is viewed as an external product or kind of a commodity that is separate from students and that they sort of passively consume or extract information from. In the framework, information is viewed as socially constructed and really context dependent. So a message might be different in a source depending on the discipline that you're using it in or the context of your information need. The framework also sees students as much more active participants in scholarship. So rather than just passively receiving information or pulling information from sources they find, the framework sees students as creating, critiquing, and really building meaning from the sources that they find. There's also a big difference in the ways that the two documents view evaluating sources. So the standards suggest that there are sort of basic guidelines that you can use to evaluate sources in really any situation, where the framework emphasizes context, and especially disciplinary context and the context of the information need as part of that source evaluation process. The two documents also describe the research process really differently. The standards, again, don't really emphasize disciplinary context. They suggest that the process is pretty much the same regardless of discipline. And in the framework, the research process is described as being nonlinear and iterative, or in other words, messy. And it also emphasizes that it's different depending on the discipline that you're in. Then finally, the two documents view learning differently, as you can see by what Amy's shared in terms of the learning theories that inform the framework. In the standards, there's a real focus on the behavioral and cognitive aspects of learning, so what students know and what they're able to do. Whereas in the framework, there's that additional focus on metacognition, reflecting on learning, and also the affective component of learning. And all of these differences that we've highlighted here come from a really great article by Nancy Fosberg, which is linked here in the slide. It's also part of the very first thing because we think it's a great introduction to the framework. So if you want to learn a little bit more about all of this, that's a great place to start. Right. Another key feature that I'll point out about the framework is that it really stresses local context and using your knowledge of your institutional context and your instructional context to guide how you use the framework. So the framework is not a prescriptive document. As you all know, it doesn't include learning outcomes or specific instructions for how to just go ahead and apply the framework. Instead, it really invites us to be creative and be innovative in what we do, which is great. Basically, there are no rules for how you implement the framework. You are invited and encouraged to figure out what works for you based on your disciplines, based on your institution. And that can be overwhelming. That can be, a bit intimidating when you're starting out with implementation. But it can also be really empowering, and it can give you a chance to kind of see your instruction program or your liaison role in a new way. And if that all just sounds kind of lofty at this point and you're wondering how you'll actually do that, later on in the webinar we'll share some practical examples to hopefully kind of give you ideas and get you thinking. And you'll also have an opportunity to share what you've already done at your institution as well.
All right, so now I'd like to transition and talk about what we've done in our work with 23 framework things. So I'm going to give a very quick tour of our website, which again is at 23frameworkthings.wordpress.com. So immediately when you get to the site, you're led to our page with all 23 things, and you can just click on each one of these to view each thing. And so here's the first one with that suggested Fosberg reading that Kim mentioned. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this whole thing is about. So this was essentially created for academic librarians to understand more and engage with the framework. All of us were or are members of the Instruction Roundtable of the Minnesota Library Association. And we decided to work on this over the past year, it's been about. And we've opened up this to anyone who wants to get involved. So each thing, basically when we looked at thing one, each thing is a prompt to get you to engage further with one aspect of the framework. So there's a prompt to get you to read something, engage somehow, answer some questions. We have a great one that's an environmental scan to look at what who your partners could be at your institution. And we wanted to put all these things together in a coherent way, so we made 4 different tracks that have that are theme related. So we have pedagogy, a frame focus where we look at each frame individually, assessment, and at your institution. As Amy mentioned, there are prizes. We are going to stop the prize tracking, as you can see in this bold date, at the end of August. We have been running this thing for about a year, but the site will stay alive and be there for participation. So we have tons of different prizes for completing different amounts of tracks. And then we have badges and buttons that we send out as well as you complete things. So here's the "What would Megan Oakleaf do" button for the assessment track. So how do you participate? You can do that often by just writing a comment with your thoughts, post some thoughts. We encourage you to work with others at your institution as well. We have a simple registration form just to get some information, and then we have our things organized here. You can always use the home page as well, but we have them organized by track. We do have a just for fun leaderboard. You can opt in or opt out to keep track of how many things you're doing and to show off the work that you've been doing. So we've got some people moving along very well here. We can see multiple people from the same institution, so they have a chance to dialogue and talk about their progress and what they've learned so far. So it's really cool to see all these names and just the diversity of where people are from. We originally thought we'd only get a few people from Minnesota participating, but it really spread across the U.S., and we actually have people from something like 9 other countries across the world participating. So let's take a look at a couple of these things. Here's the environmental scan that I mentioned. So we have a suggested reading and an activity where you identify who your stakeholders and partners are at your institution, and then just comment about where you are currently at your institution. Some other types of things that we have, different formats. As was mentioned in number 19, we make use of Flipgrid videos. And then we also encourage response through the use of Flipgrid. So these just are 30 to 45-second videos where you post your response about the questions that we ask. I'm going to jump back to our site, and I want to show finally our look at our frame focus track. So these ask you to either find an example of a research-based article or lesson plan on each specific frame, and then talk about that. Find a lesson plan that you think would be useful for an area that you teach. Or you can use some inspiration from what you found and then create your own lesson and post it here, and you can get feedback as well. Okay. So that's an overview of our site.
All right. So next, we're going to share a few quick introductions to a range of examples of how the framework has been implemented in the humanities and in related areas. So this first example, one way that the framework calls for faculty to engage with the framework is by identifying threshold concepts or specialized information skills in their disciplines. And so if anyone out there is a writing studies liaison or you work with writing programs, you are very lucky because writing studies has already begun this process in the book Naming What We Know, which is a book that identifies threshold concepts in writing studies. So there's an article that we've highlighted here And it's also in thing number 15, which focuses on collaborating with writing programs. And in this article, the authors, Johnson and McCracken, identified shared threshold concepts in information literacy and in writing studies through a really close reading of both Naming What We Know and the framework. And one thing that they note is that both approaches in Naming What We Know and in the framework both focus on highlighting core concepts rather than kind of isolated skills. And that's intended to facilitate deeper learning. And it's great that both of these disciplines have kind of moved toward this approach. So I think this article is a really great way to start a conversation with writing instructors if that's an area that you work with. It's a great way to identify overlap in the content that we're teaching and kind of expand discussions around how these guiding documents might facilitate collaboration.
All right, moving on to some digital humanities examples. Do we have anyone with us who is involved with digital humanities or that's a part of their work? Just out of curiosity, if you want to add that to the chat box. So I think that the framework really interacts well with a lot of the approaches to doing digital humanities and digital scholarship as a librarian. But there is a little bit of a danger, as this first article that I've highlighted, or that we've highlighted points out, is the sort of dreaded trap of buttonology. So, we've worked really hard to position ourselves as expert in information literacy and sort of really focus on these bigger concepts, and avoid sort of the tool-based instruction that was really common prior to the framework and in the standards. But I know I'm a little bit guilty of this. I've done this a few times too, where you start working on digital humanities partnerships and working with classes, and you start working with all these really cool tools, and sometimes you let the tool take over your instruction. And so this article does a really good job of helping us avoid that and, really talking about how some of the aspects of the framework, including the liminal state of learners and, opportunities to incorporate metacognitive moments into our teaching and how we can do that in our digital humanities instruction. Another thing, too, is I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with the site Hybrid Pedagogy, but this site is really great if you need some ideas for incorporating critical digital pedagogy into your teaching practice. So, if you go on the site and search ACRL framework, you're probably not going to find much, but many of the articles that are shared, and this is an open access journal / community of practice, really, again, are leveraging a lot of those theories that underline the framework. So just to kind of give you a taste. So one article by Trevor Hogue is entitled The Pretense of Neutrality, Twitter, Digital Literacy, and First-Year Writing. And he talks about how he does controversy mapping using Timeline.js and Storify, and how he has an assignment that has students analyze rhetorical claims on Twitter using Voyant, which is a way to do some lexical analysis. There's other articles about multimodality, sort of critiquing some of the way we approach plagiarism and the gatekeeping that is sort of involved with that. Anyway, there's a lot of really good instructional ideas and ways that we can bring the framework into our digital humanities instruction as well. And in addition, there is a special issue of the College and Undergraduate Libraries Journal that has, it's all about digital humanities, and there's a whole section and series of articles that talk about incorporating the framework into instruction. And last time I checked, we didn't have any digital humanities types assignments in our frame focus thing, so it'd be really cool to see some of those added, perhaps using some of these resources.
Great. All right. When you are looking for examples or lesson plans for how do I apply this to my discipline, one of the sites that we recommend, um, well, there are two great sites that are set up for this. One is the ACRL Framework Sandbox. Then there's also Project Cora, and Cora is an acronym standing for Community of Online Research Assignments. So they are both great for finding lesson plans and ways to employ the framework into your teaching. So I just pulled up a couple of examples that could be used in the humanities. The first one could really be used in any discipline. What it has students do essentially is to find a scholarly article and check their understanding by creating an infographic about what it's about. So you can see in this example, the student has broken it down into the main sections and has shown that graphically, so shown it in a different way. The other looks at scholarly journal abstracts and looks at the comparison between social science abstracts, which are very structured and set up kind of in the, there's usually a sentence about the research question, a sentence about the methodology, a sentence about results, and then their conclusion. And this looks a little bit different in the humanities when you are analyzing a text, for example, in a paper. So it looks at the differences between different types of abstracts that you'll find where there are actually the same elements in there, it just can be a little bit more difficult to piece those out. So it shows a good example comparing two different abstracts.
All right, so I'll talk a little bit about some examples from art and music. In Thing 16, that one focuses on discipline-specific instruction, which is a mouthful. And so there are a lot of different examples there that you can check out if your discipline has not been discussed so far. So these two articles that I'm highlighting here focus on how the framework can relate to creative disciplines. And so I previously, for I think about the first 4 or 5 years I was here at UMD, I was the art and design liaison. And during that time, my experience was that students and faculty definitely saw me as a resource for traditional research assignments, for academic work, but they didn't necessarily identify me as a resource for creative work. And so what's great about these two articles is that they highlight how we can make information literacy and research skills feel more relevant for students who are focused more on their creative practice and maybe less on more traditional research assignments. And this seems like a really natural pairing for the framework because the framework, as we've discussed throughout this session, really emphasizes students as creators and not just consumers of information. So that's kind of a natural connection. So throughout both these articles, there are a lot of really great examples of ways that the framework has been used to inform information literacy in these creative disciplines. But one thing that they both have in common is that they focus a lot about the importance of context in the creative process and how that relates to information literacy. So the author of the second article, Connor, wrote that no creative work exists in isolation. In order to fully appreciate its meaning, your audience needs to view your work in a context that you define. And so both these articles talk about ways that the librarians who wrote them worked with faculty to create assignments that make use of the scholarship as conversation frame to help students kind of put their creative work within a larger context. So in the Garcia and Labat article, the authors talk about an artist statement bibliography that was an assignment in a course. And in that assignment, students needed to identify resources that informed their work, inspired their creative work, or that helped them contextualize their work in sort of a larger historical context. In Connor's article, students completed a more traditional assignment, a literature review that helped them identify disciplinary conversations around personal interests in their discipline. So they were really encouraged to focus just on topics that they were interested in, not necessarily traditional academic topics, and then figure out what unresolved questions were there and use their literature review to develop an original research question and not just summarize what had already been published. Another really great example from the Connor article, and a great example of metacognition. Students were invited to both reflect on the research process, but also complete an exercise where they imagine themselves in conversation with the authors of their assigned course readings. So they were encouraged to think about what questions the authors would ask them about the research they were doing, and what questions they would like to ask the authors about the work that they had done. So some really great examples to explore here to help you make connections between creative work and the framework.
So in our poll at the beginning of today's webinar, many of you indicated that you also work with the history department, but I think some of these examples could be relevant to folks in other disciplines who work with primary sources. You know, depending on what type of literary analysis someone is doing, they might be looking into some historical sources. And there's some really great resources out there, and I'm just going to go over these really quickly in the interest of time so we have some time to hear from you all and do some discussion. But one thing I recently found out is the Society of American Archivists has mapped their primary source literacies onto the framework. So that's really neat. So if you click that, you can see how that plays out and start incorporating that into your teaching practice if you work with classes that are utilizing primary sources. Many of us, I think, are aware of the study that came out from the Stanford History Education Group that looked at middle, high school, and college students' ability to assess online information or lack thereof ability. So the results, I think, for many, maybe for librarians, weren't super surprising, but I think for the history community, were a little bit alarming. In a response to this study, the Stanford History Education Group created a whole curriculum to respond to some of these maybe gaps or challenges that students are facing. And there's some really good stuff there, and I also think that there's a real opportunity for us to use this as a way to have conversations with history departments and actually add a lot of expertise to some of the lesson plans that they have posted that are informed by the framework. And then lastly, there's a book that recently came out in 2017 that is Disciplinary Applications of Information Literacy Threshold Concepts. And I haven't made it through the entire thing. This is definitely one of those books that you can kind of poke into and pick out the chapters that relate to the areas that you work with. And there is one chapter in there that talks about leveraging the language of the past and looks at the searching and strategic exploration frame in the discipline of history. And I know that a lot of you all are from other areas, business, philosophy, theology, and there's really a wealth of examples in here. So just another resource that you can use to inspire you as you're completing the frame focus track in 23 Things or operating and working in your community of practice. Discussion, which can be a little bit challenging in a webinar format, but I hope that you all could add a little bit in the chat box about what you've been doing at your institution and how you have been incorporating the framework into your teaching practice and the different areas you work with, particularly in the humanities. I think another thing to keep in mind as we're sort of thinking about this question is that though I think a lot of us are shifting our teaching practice a little bit because of the framework, there are many instances of things that we're already doing that really mesh with the concepts and learning theories that underline the framework. So keeping that in mind as well.
Wow, it looks like we have so many experienced people sharing some really good things in the chat.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who's shared ideas here. I think there are a lot of great directions and resources that you've all pointed out. We're going to transition next here to talking a bit about how we can continue this conversation via communities of practice. And there are many different definitions you can find about communities of practice. The one that I've highlighted here says that communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. The three kind of components of a community of practice are a domain or a shared topic or interest, a community or group of people who interact regularly, and then practice, so the focus on improving and learning more. So as an example here, I have an image of UMD's Quidditch Club. So this is a group or a community that focuses on a shared topic of interest, in this case Quidditch from Harry Potter, and they practice regularly and improve their Quidditch skills together. None of them can fly though, is what I'm told, but they do improve their skills together through communities. So that's one example, and I'll share a few non-Quidditch examples here. So communities of practice can be really formal, they can be very informal, and they can happen at a lot of different levels. So as an example, a local community of practice can be as simple as getting a group of folks who are maybe other liaison librarians, other teaching librarians together for lunch and talking about, different articles or topics in information literacy and how they connect to our disciplines and our liaison work. Food is not a required element of a community of practice, but it definitely helps, I have found. As Trent mentioned earlier, the three of us are all part of the Minnesota Library Association Instruction Roundtable, and so we consider that a regional community of practice. We host workshops, we host regular meetings and discussions where people can get together and talk about topics of interest connected to information literacy. And that's really helped us kind of identify local experts in our region and work together to develop our knowledge around the framework. And then finally, at the national level, 23 Framework Things is a great opportunity to interact with other folks who are engaging with the framework from all over the nation and globally. And then the LES section, who we're so appreciative of hosting us today, is another community of practice that can help you engage with the framework in a really discipline-specific kind of way. So what we'd like to ask you to do in the chat is identify any additional communities of practice that you participate in that would help you continue your learning about the framework. So these, again, can be formal, they can be informal, they can be at the local level, or any level that applies to you. And one thing I'll note as you are all typing is that you certainly don't have to feel like an expert on the framework to participate in a community of practice around it. I think we can all learn from each other regardless of our levels of expertise or experience. Nice. So it looks like there's a variety of library communities of practice, state-level communities of practice, and it's something that you can certainly, if you don't feel like you have a community to connect with, you have an opportunity then to create a community and invite some like-minded folks to maybe join you in discussing the framework on a regular basis. And so I'd like to turn it over to Ava to talk a little bit about the LES section and how that might serve as a community of practice for you moving forward. And also, as she does that, if you have questions for us in these last few minutes, please feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat as well.
Thanks so much, Kim. Yes, so this webinar was put on by the Virtual Participation Committee, which is a committee that is a part of Literatures in English section of ACRL. We do have an LES-specific listserv, and you are more than welcome to also volunteer for any of the committees. Our call for volunteers just opened up in December, but anyone can join the listserv, and there's a lot of humanities specific support there as well. And then I think, as you can see from our wonderful speakers and then a lot of the discussion that's happening in the chat, there's not one specific way to approach it. Oh my goodness. Okay, are you able to hear my audio? Yes, okay, just making sure. Sorry about that. Yes, so please, I hope that this has inspired you to come at the framework in a number of ways. The Literatures in English section, especially virtual participation, we are always looking for ways to engage regardless of where we are. So we are looking for online engagement. Related to this, we will be hosting a Twitter conversation starting with some of the things that we talked about in this webinar. We will be sending out more information to the listservs that we advertise this webinar on, but you can please feel free to join us in the Twitter discussion. We're going to pick a night of the week for us to have a discussion, much like CritLib if you have done that on Twitter, where we discuss the framework and humanities librarianship and some other issues as well. So we'll have more information, including hashtags and a date and time for you as well that you can engage in. But all of these different ways that you can continue this discussion and also share your experience and learn from others. And then again, if you do have any other questions, especially for our speakers, feel free to share it in the chat for us to discuss in the last couple of minutes that we have left. I'm going to wait just a little longer for people to... All right. Well, great. If there are no other questions, please look out on your listservs for more information. Please join us in our Twitter discussion. Thank you again to our wonderful speakers, Amy, Kim, and Trent. This was so much really good information. And then special thanks to my co-chair, Ginny, for putting this out. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you do have any questions that come up later, you can feel free to email any of one of us, and we'd be happy to answer them.